And welcome to another Green Tech Media webinar. This webinar is a part of a series of webinars we do throughout the year to help keep professionals in the grid edge and renewables markets industries informed through research and analysis on the latest technologies and market trends. Today's presentation, Virtual Power Plants and the Road to DERMS, It's a Distributed Energy World, is brought to you with support from our sponsor, Enbala Power Networks. I'm Ben Kellison. I'm the Director of Grid Research at GTM Research, a Green Tech Media company. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Green Tech Media is an online publisher for information on the global power and grid technology industry. GTM Research is the market analysis and consulting arm of Green Tech Media. You can stay informed by reading the news at greentechmedia.com and find out more about our research products by visiting gtmresearch.com. You can also click the GTM icon at the bottom of your screen for more information about our company. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over the screen in front of you so you can make the most of the time we have with our speakers. You'll notice there's a dock at the bottom of the screen with several widgets. Some of the widgets that may be of interest include the Download Slides widget, which has a link to download the PDF of this presentation. Near the center of the bar, you'll find a Speakers Bios widget. You can find out more about our speakers that we have with us today. And on the far right, you'll see a widget that allows you to share this webinar through preferred social media outlets. And most importantly, if you look on the far left, you'll see a Q&A dialog box. You can enter questions that you have throughout the webinar. Any technical questions that you have we'll address throughout the webinar, and any additional questions regarding the content of the webinar we'll address in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. Finally, to enlarge the slide area, just click on the white square in the top right-hand side of the presentation area window. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Bud Voss, the President and CEO of Enbala Power Networks, Vikram Singh, Manager of Emerging Technologies at Electra, and Vikram Singh, the Manager of Emerging Technologies at Electra. Before we get too deep into their presentations, I wanted to talk a little bit about DERMS and provide a little bit more context around the discussion around that particular technology set and product suite. The way it gets talked about oftentimes in the broader energy conversation is in a very broad strokes type of way, in which we bring a lot of functions underneath one product suite name of DERMS. GTM has gone to pretty strong lengths over the past year to try and refine these areas and be able to provide more context associated with the various functions and various capabilities and requirements that are needed for integrating DER into distribution grids, into transmission grids and wholesale markets. And in that discussion, we've kind of come up with this DER lifecycle management process, which is greater than just one software system and brings together a lot of the capabilities that exist today or are being built within utilities to better include these resources within traditional utility processes and better adapt them to be beneficial to the grid. So we go a little bit deeper into this. What you'll see here, obviously, it's a little bit small, but is many systems are a part of that DER lifecycle process. You have on the planning side, registration, modeling, and interconnection efforts, which include several different utility systems, from customer information systems to work management platforms to ensure interconnections are done in a safe and reliable way. You have kind of the operations area, which is that kind of green space in the middle, which involves price signals and actual optimization and usage. And then finally, you have kind of the post-event or the long-term maintenance side, where you have that settlement billing and maintenance. When we talk about distributed energy resource management and those particular software suites, we're really talking about the real-time systems involved. There are a lot of legacy systems that operate on both sides of that real-time area, and even within that real-time box, if you look at distribution management platforms, energy management systems, demand response management systems for that matter. But really, what we're talking about is the intraday scheduling, operations, monitoring, and optimization of particular DER resources when we talk about distributed energy resource management. So within that, there's kind of three sub-levels of capabilities that have been kind of developed through various legacies that various vendors of software have had over time. Together, these equal essentially an enterprise DERMS platform. But when we look at that enterprise DERMS platform, we don't see vendors today being able to fully accommodate the full range of capabilities and requirements needed to directly control as well as indirectly control DERs through aggregators and be able to monitor and understand what's happening through DERs that are not under their direct purview. So what we've seen develop is essentially these three models, and oftentimes they're tied to not just the vendor capabilities, but also the requirements from the utilities and or third parties that are actually purchasing this software. The most common model that we find is kind of what we call fleet DERMS. And these applications are largely focused on addressing wholesale market needs, getting DERs aggregated so they can actually access value streams at the wholesale level. Most common beyond that, we see this kind of centralized DERMS application or centralized DERMS view, which moves away from kind of that pure VPP model and more towards a integrated distribution model, where you're operating that system more as a peer to a DMS and enabling potentially some DSO functionalities and better understanding how DERs are integrating with the distribution rather than the wholesale market. And then finally you have kind of what we term edge DERMS, which essentially is largely focused on dealing with reliability concerns or very fast switch use cases where you're preventing overloads on feeders or potentially trying to correct for potential power quality problems that may come up due to DERs located deep within a distribution network. To give a little bit of context on the overall market within North America, we see about 46 active and complete DERMS projects within the U.S. and Canada through July of 2017. Geographic range of these projects points to the broad utility interest in gaining the experience and capabilities to manage a more decentralized energy system. But as expected, there are significant concentrations of projects in California, Hawaii, and New York. What's often noted less frequently is the fact that many of these projects and many of the largest utilities are investing in emerging DERMS functionalities aren't in these geographies. It's actually spread to almost half the states within the U.S. And mid-sized utilities are driving market development both in states with high DER penetration and states with DER penetration is low. But utilities in many of these areas are looking at developing them more for customer programs, not necessarily just for pure reliability purposes. Municipal utilities in particular are looking at DERMS investments to deliver choice, savings, and resiliency for customers on one hand and grid services on the other. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bud, who can talk a little bit more about some of the software requirements and some of the capabilities required today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. And I really appreciate you hosting us today, and I appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy schedule to learn a little bit more on this concept of both DERMS and virtual power plants. And I think, many of you who have seen Enbala and seen our presentations, we typically start with this picture because I think this picture is aspirational to, frankly, what it is we're trying to do in this industry. We are trying to look forward towards a clean, distributed, renewable future, not just here in North America, but broadly across the globe. And some countries are ahead of us, some countries are behind us. But I think everybody is looking forward towards this new sustainable energy future. What's important is what has done as a result of that is we've seen dramatic growth in renewables and in the broad spectrum of sustainability, not just here in North America locally, but also abroad. This is a chart that's been put together and published just recently looking at the effects of normal predictions of renewable energy growth throughout the course of the world. This was put together by the IEA. Every one of these curves, the colored lines, is actually the forecast that was created, the year upon which the color kind of corresponds to. And you can see that there's one consistent theme, which is the forecast has been wrong year after year after year. And so we see dramatic growth in the renewable energy space. And as a result of that, we're seeing our grid fundamentally change. Not only are we seeing our grid change, we're seeing the new effects of having large fleets of distributed energy resources on the grid, not just centralized in the form of grid scale renewables or grid scale batteries, but we're also seeing a big push towards distributed renewables. And as we know, what that's done is it's created an entirely new way that we have to think about our distributed energy future, and frankly, the way that we operate and maintain our grid. At Enbala, we like to engage with our customers and with our clients and people all around the world, talking about the fact that the industry that we know it today is fundamentally going to be different 20 years from now. In fact, it may not even exist. It may not even look like the grid and the operating system and the utilities that we know and love today. The grid's going to invert, and in addition to that, when we take that to the extreme, the assets that are actually operating on that system are going to be largely variable. As a result of that, we know for a fact that we are focused on today on a monumental transformation that we call the grid edge. And everything that we're talking about today is built around the idea that the grid edge is fundamentally going to be going through a massive transformation. And everything that Ben just laid out in terms of the work that GTM's been doing to look at this concept of the grid edge and distributed energy resources is building to this idea of what are the systems that we actually need to maintain and control those systems. So I took a quick snapshot across the entire industry and a very quick summary of the words that are used. And this is something that I think is fundamentally important. And you see all of these words being used. Some people capture these as virtual power plants. Some people capture these as pooling plants. Some people think about demand side energy. They think about DERMS or distributed energy resource management. Some people are still thinking about DRMSs or demand response management systems evolving to handle DERMS-like applications. And so you could kind of take this word art and use any combination of these terms to actually formulate what's going on in the industry and put a name on it. And again, at Enbala, we like to focus much more on kind of what is the use case and the business case that's ultimately driving the need for the solution. And so we like to think about two fundamental concepts. The first called the virtual power plant, the second called the distributed energy resource management. Now, you might characterize these similar to the way that Ben was talking about. The virtual power plant looks a lot like essentially fleet DERMS, if you use their terminology. The DERMS solution that we think about at Enbala is much more driven around the use cases of what utilities need as these distributed energy resources become integrated into their distribution management system and their distribution system writ large. So when we think about the business case behind these, we think about, at Enbala, we think about virtual power plants typically end up providing system-wide benefits of some kind. They're either doing capacity relief, replacement reserves, ancillary services. The point is that they're being used at a fundamental level where they're providing benefit to the entire power system and not in a locational sense. The DERMS mantra that we like to use kind of comes into play when you're starting to now look at things locational and you need the assets fully integrated into the distribution system. And the distribution management system, GIS, and the alphabet soup of utility systems that help manage and control the distribution management system. And unfortunately, we're coming from a world where largely grid edge type resources and assets that are deployed on the grid edge looked a lot like demand response resources. And now we're moving into a world where you see multi-asset capabilities, load management being coupled with batteries, being coupled with generators, managing solar systems, and pulling all these things together. But because a large part of this distributed energy industry is coming from the area of demand response, we tend to recognize that flexibility is the key to reliability and that we need to leverage these resources in order to build a more reliable power system. But the challenge comes when we start to think about them as Legos. And I'll use this analogy here for just a moment to describe a little bit of why we think this is a fundamental flaw. Lego building blocks are awesome, and I played with them a lot as a child. I'm sure many of us on this call did. But there's one characteristic to them. In some sense, they're all the same. They're all the same width. They have the same spacing. They have the same height. And so while you can construct really, really interesting things with Legos, at the end of the day, they're all based on one fundamental unit, which is largely the same. Unfortunately, this distributed energy future, when we start putting all these distributed energy resources at the edge of our grid, none of them are the same. They all have different ramp rates. They all have different constraints. Some of them are loads. Some of them are generators. They all behave in very varied and wide and distributed ways, in disparate ways. And so we like to think about it, instead of being a pile of Legos, we like to think of all of these assets as a pile of batteries. And that means certainly true batteries like energy storage devices and lithium ion and behind the meter resources and things like that, but even loads that are managing storage in the form of heat or cooling of a building, pressure in a pipe, or electric vehicles, or even PV and solar generation. Those are really just batteries with no storage. Or even behind the meter traditional generators such as CHP. Because you see, we believe when you think about these as a pile of batteries that all have different characteristics, and you begin to actually optimize them, we can come right back to this picture here, and we can begin to think very clearly about how that virtual power plant can provide system level benefit. And then over time, as we proliferate the market and we put more and more distributed energy resources on the grid distribution system, we have to transition to the distributed energy resource management system, or the utility side of things. And so this is the capstone to all of this, which is, as we've moved in this industry of the grid edge from the area of load control and demand response, and we've done a great job in kind of DR 2.0 called Auto DR, where we've created the ability to make all of these assets work together, we believe we're now moving to an entirely new world where you need this pile of batteries, so to speak, to be doing closed loop, real-time optimization, bidirectional wholesale transactions, meaning you can give power back and you can take power away, and you need to be ready for the ability to integrate into the distribution system. And that's part of what Enbala does, is we work with our partners and our customers to be able to envision this future and drive towards that market. Where are we at in that market? I actually think in North America, largely, we're going to see three waves as we go through this transition. Today, we still think largely about capacity-based markets, where we're using capacity-based pricing and wholesale markets to justify things, this DR 2.0 world. But all of our customers are looking at this trajectory towards distribution-connected DERs, and we will transition through virtual power plants, and we're seeing that today with a lot of our customers. I would say around the world, probably controversial to maybe say, but I actually think that places like Australia and some parts of Europe and the UK are actually ahead of North America today in this transition. And as Ben said, we're starting to now see early pilots in that distribution area of DERMS, and Enbala is involved in some of those. And I think it's an exciting area as we start seeing how these things are all completely linked and both optimizing for the local distribution effects that we need, as well as the wholesale market capabilities of these assets writ large. With that, I'm going to pause quickly so you see my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you would ever like to, and I will pass it over to Vikram from here, who's going to talk a little bit about the things that Electra is doing specifically as they work through this transition. I think it's a very exciting story. But on to you.
Thanks, Bud. So, so great sort of setup, I think, right now to the rest of our discussion here, which is essentially what we at Electra, how we view the DER world, and where we see DERMS fitting into our future plans of being able to control and aggregate distributed resources that are being deployed closer to the edge of the grid. A little bit of quick background for those of you who might not know who Electra is. We're basically a local distribution company in LDC in Ontario. We're made up of two distinct companies, wholly owned subsidiaries. Electra Utilities, our regulated arm, and Energy Solutions, which is our unregulated affiliate. We have approximately 1,000 customers in our service territory, about $3.5 billion in assets. We're right now the second largest municipally owned utility municipally owned LDC, that is, in North America. So really, our job and our focus and our view here in Ontario is to manage the medium and low voltage side of the network. That's the way that our regulatory compact is kind of structured here in the province. So really, what we're facing are a lot of the challenges that at this point many of you will be familiar with if you read about industry, if you read about sort of the industry forecasts and where generation and distribution is kind of trending towards. So, we've taken more of I would say more of an adoptive approach, more of an inclusive approach to qualifying or quantifying the benefits of DERs as they pertain to distribution and as they pertain to distribution value. So what we've done is we've actually decided to experiment as much as possible with DERs to get a practical view as to what their capabilities are. So first we'll go over what type of track record we've had in the DER space, what kind of DERs we have in our network. Second, why the timing was right for us to start exploring DERMS and what we believe the definition of a valuable DERMS platform is. And third, some of the quantified benefits that we've identified for DERs and what kind of value they bring to us, particularly as a utility operator or distribution level network operator. So we'll start off with basically some of our deployments. We took an approach with in the DER space to basically evaluate of all different, I guess, 3 different categories of DERs, and they're pretty straightforward. They're basically small, medium, and large. We see opportunities for residential microgrids, or what we call nanogrids, medium-sized commercial installations that we're calling sort of C&I type of microgrid technologies, and utility-scale microgrid projects. So essentially, we believe that the future of our business doesn't necessarily rely around us picking which one of these different configurations are going to necessarily become the market winners. Our objective is to be able to offer all of them within the marketplace and effectively let the market decide what works best based on locational value and market conditions. I'll start off with our smallest first. This is a residential scale microgrid project. It's all under PowerStream branding right now, which is a legacy utility. Electra is a result of a 4-way merger between utilities here in Ontario. PowerStream was one of our legacy utilities. So what we've done is we deployed basically residential solar and storage on a number of homes within our service territory, and those units were basically aggregated under a virtual power plant, I guess, architecture infrastructure. The objective for this was really to identify how we as a utility could exert ownership over residential assets in order to effectively deliver benefit on both sides of the meter. So this really starts to get into the definition of what we believe to be a virtual power plant, which aligns pretty well with some of the definitions you've heard earlier today. This is really along the control and dispatch layer of the architecture with some optimization, what I would call co-optimization, in order to deliver or share benefits on both sides of the meter. So these units had a fleet of assets within our service territory that were utility owned, but we allowed the customers to retain 50% of the battery capacity, and we would leverage the other 50% of the battery capacity to basically exercise the units to showcase how they could actually contribute to distribution level network benefits. And we see a lot of great savings that have come out of that program, both on the customer side, and we've quantified a lot of the benefits from our side, which I'll get into greater detail a little bit later on. I'll now jump to the bigger side of the equation, which is really the what we call the utility scale microgrid technologies that we've experimented with. Our feature installation really was our KEPCO Penetang machine microgrid project. KEPCO is a Korean electric power company. We deployed a large bulk storage solution in a northern community, a remote community here in Ontario, about 750 kVA, 500 kilowatt hour battery. Typical issues with a community or a substation at the end of a long line, voltage issues, outage problems. So as opposed to going for a traditional utility asset, we decided to reinforce the station with a bulk solution. So there is an autonomous microgrid controller that right now is visible through our SCADA system in our operations room and is operating as essentially a distribution asset. We are evaluating a number of discrete use cases. But again, right now it's basically controlled independently. We don't necessarily have sort of a universe or a more abstract control over this asset as it pertains to an entire portfolio of distributed energy resources. This is a more standalone installation right now. But the distribution automation was a key sort of driver for the value of this particular project. And then finally, we have the commercial scale microgrid on our facility in Ontario here in Vaughan. We've actually deployed our own microgrid, which has been in service for about 6 years now. And this will actually be the subject of our first foray into the distributed energy resource management world, in other words, the DERMS software control world. We will be upgrading the control platform that currently manages this microgrid with the Imbala software. And effectively, the reason that we went down this route is, again, you'll sense a recurring theme with us at Electra. So, there is a lot of vernacular and a lot of taxonomy out in the industry right now around what are DERMS, what are VPPs, what are DMSs, what are ADMSs. I mean, all of the language is starting to intermingle. So we felt that the only way for us to get a real handle on where the different demarcation points for control and logic really lied, we needed to get experimental. So we picked a safe sort of initial deployment, which is behind the meter microgrid that powers a portion of our existing facility. As you can see, we have a number of renewable and non-renewable technologies that are controllable. We have a vehicle-to-grid charger. We have some dual-axis tracking solar and a couple of different battery technologies. And the idea is, since we have controllable loads, since we have a fleet of EVs and a load bank, we'd be able to basically exercise a number of different use cases to see what their benefits were and how really the DERMS platform will respond to a variety of different conditions. So that brings us to kind of the next point here, which is, why are we doing this and what's the real value of DERMS? And to be honest, we didn't really know when we started out this exercise, but we were able to distill it to 5 main points. If we had to describe the DERMS platform of the future that solved the ideal set of problems that we think will be emerging as DERs proliferate in our network, or to take advantage, I should say, as well, of their functionality that they may provide. This is kind of how I would see it. The top 2 really focus on how do you operationalize DERs. I think there's a planning function in trying to understand exactly how you would model these assets and what type of functionality they provide, and also how would you account for their integration into the existing network. That is not a language that current planning teams speak right now in the utility space, at least not many of them. Our planning teams are still getting used to using traditional asset planning tools and essentially adapting them to this new reality of bidirectional energy flow, distributed resource management, analytics, and really this wide-ranging, diverse set of assets that you have the ability to leverage. The second really is a flexibility and interoperability sort of function. We see the diffusion of DERs as being fairly challenging from an interoperability standpoint, mainly because these networks tend to be somewhat brittle. You can have a bunch of different technologies that come online. Maybe storage is kind of the flavor of the day today, or solar, or bidirectional EV chargers. But at the end of the day, as new devices come online, how do you ensure standardization across these different assets, and how do you abstract yourself away from that responsibility? And part of that is on the DERM side, and I would say part of it is really a standards conversation. But I don't want to focus too much on those first 2. Really, the next 3 that are the ones that I'm gonna really key in on today. Really, it's the ITOT and market integration. So if you have a fleet of distributed energy resources, how can a DERMS actually interface with your existing platforms? Bud mentioned a few of them, but our GIS system, our SCADAs, our OMS, our outage management systems, really all of our operating platforms are interconnected. And if you want a holistic view of how DERs can be leveraged, and that's the benefit of DERs. DERs have a sense of flexibility and a value in their optionality that can only be captured once they are being leveraged by basically all the different stakeholders within the utilities operations team. So really our challenge here is to try to figure out how do we bridge that IT/OT gap in order to make these DER assets visible to our operations team. Not traditional assets. The second two really are how do you split the value? We think that the value of DERs as they exist today, obviously depends. It is intrinsically tied to the type of resource that you're talking about deploying, but also to the location, the specific location that you deploy it at. So there are locational benefits from a network side. There are obviously sort of regulatory and policy issues that may make certain technologies more economically viable than others. But really for us, the key is to be able to have a control platform that allows you to split that value fairly and justly between the stakeholders that receive the benefit, or that qualify for the benefit. And in our case, that's both the customer and the grid. So tying in really quickly here on the DERMS side, I don't want to spend too much time on this in terms of the integration piece, because I think it's been touched upon in earlier slides. Really the way that we see the stack kind of being laid out, we see there's, as you get down to the bottom of the period, you're closer to metal. Hardware interoperability and integration is very similar to a lot of other industrial IoT problems that are certainly, being handled right now in various different ways. So, when we look at vendors and we look at technologies that are in this space, we're cognizant of who solved that IoT problem, who's taking a forward-looking view at how to integrate a device into a broader scheme of control architectures, who's leveraging standards, as I mentioned before, and who's being a little more forward-looking. We go up to local control software, which, sort of edge devices that manage communications amongst either one or many different assets that might be on the ground. And then we see VPP as kind of that layer that sits on top of that. It's a bit of an analytics big data layer that directly interfaces with control platforms that may be distributed across your network. And then as you go up one more layer, we see the DERMS, the functionality of the DERMS side, really to be the market and SCADA integration piece, really determining how do you manage either maybe conflicting calls for services, how do you balance needs from market participation versus local distribution needs, and what kind of trade-offs those involve, both financially and in terms of compliance and performance. So that's kind of how we see the network shaping up. But really, this is our view of the world, is that when we look for a DERMS vendor, we need for them to be able to qualify each one of the challenges that sort of fall under this pyramid, and demonstrate how they're going to adapt to them and allow us to manage some of the uncertainties that come with them. On the customer value side here, both on the customer and the grid value side, I'm going to use an illustrative example, which is basically the study that we did with our virtual power plant on the powerhouse side. Effectively, when we look at DERs and their integration into our grid system, what we first want to do is quantify what's the baseline level of benefit that we can deliver to the customer. And so what we did, as I mentioned earlier, we have residential customers who are deploying solar and storage. And as we saw, we were able to share both the capacity of the storage with our distribution network side and with the customer side. And as you can see here, it created tremendous benefit on the customer side, about 43% bill savings. It's about $1,000 a year and a lot of outage protection. So it's been a resounding success on the customer side. On the grid value side, we had to quantify basically what types of market services we wanted to illustrate or demonstrate with this virtual power plant. So we identified a few and effectively determined how we would stack those values in real time. So the data that we show here is actually the dispatch profile of our entire fleet of 20 assets as they participate in various different value streams. And these are the value streams that we had identified as delivering short-term benefit to our network. So the good news is that there's no technical reason why DERs shouldn't be able to participate in market services. The tricky part is how do you develop a software protocol or a software control platform that allows you to co-optimize amongst potentially competing requirements, and then also how do you develop or implement the market constructs that you need to be able to implement in order to both procure, settle, and verify some of these transactions. Finally, sort of, on our side, TX and DX deferral assessment, we went through an actual exercise of quantifying what we thought the distribution and transmission level deferral was going to be for a fleet of distributed assets. In our case, it was 30,000 behind-the-meter residential solar storage units, and how would we control them in order to be able to defer a certain amount of capital for a substation. Turns out the number was relatively small, but it was a fairly small need for us in terms of load growth. But in the end, and it was also a bit of I would say, a conservative view, assuming sort of overhead wiring and a number of different sort of, I would say, more conservative metrics for the substation upgrade. But in any case, the point is that no single value stream is the one that's going to pencil out for DERs. And everyone's heard about the value stack. For us, that's intrinsically important. We didn't want to model the production. We didn't want to model the justification or the value of DER solely on a group or one specific use case, be it capital deferral or frequency regulation or market participation. What we wanted to do is showcase that irrespective of how the markets moved, we had a flexible resource or a flexible control platform that could repurpose our assets to effectively deliver value based on what the market provided. So based on the actual market services that we modeled and based on our own provincial outlook, our own Ontario's provincial outlook, we found that the net cumulative benefits of a large-scale DER deployment vary over time. But the net result is that both scenarios turned out to be positive, both in our baseline case and what we call our deep decarbonization case. So it's interesting to note here that, Bud had touched on it as well earlier, the values of DERs to kind of increase exponentially with the penetration of renewables in our network, mainly because there's a lot of volatility, obviously, that brings to the table. So we've got a number of different policy initiatives that are currently underway here in Ontario around EV penetration and proliferation around solar, around storage, around conversion from gas to electric heat. So there are different versions of our future grid, of our future reality, and that makes forecasting relatively difficult. So, in our view, it's just intrinsically important for all of our operations, from planning all the way down to operations and execution, to be able to quantify what DERs are capable of and how we can leverage them in a reliable way to capture some of this value and some of this upside. So that's kind of the end of my slide deck. I think I'll hand it back over to Ben to open up the floor for any questions that the audience might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Vikram, and thank you, Bud, as well, for some good presentations to set the stage for some Q&A. I think we have well over the number of questions that we can address in 20 minutes, but please, we'll be reordering kind of dynamically based on what comes in. So if you have additional questions, feel free to enter it on the left side of that dialog box. I just want to mention, for those of you who have been on the webinar from the start, we apologize. We did have some initial technical problems with the sound, and thank you for staying with us. We will be posting a cleaned archive version of the webinar within the next 48 hours or so if you'd like to review or share this content with any colleagues. So one thing I did want to mention before we go any further, for those who are on today's webinar, I did want to offer a discount code for upcoming events. You don't miss the opportunity to kind of dive deeper into these topics as well as several others, and to network with thought leaders at the various GTM events planned over the next 6 months. You can enter in the code all caps webinar within any of those, within the registration pages of any of those events to get a 15% discount. And so with that, I wanted to start us off. Will ease us into the more difficult questions. But Vikram, we had one question just asking on the microgrid side of things. You mentioned 3 different microgrid projects. They had some questions on what you meant when you said microgrid. Is there capabilities to operate independently and or island? And also a rough idea on kind of the amount of time that islanding can occur.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess on each scale, the microgrids, I mean, that's a fair question. I mean, microgrid itself is kind of almost an undefined term, or was for a little while there. In all of our cases, all of our microgrid research focuses on microgrids that have islanding capability. In the case of the Penadine project, it had a 4-hour ride-through capability for the community that it serviced. So islanding, we find, because in generally speaking, at every layer of abstraction that I went over, both the small, medium, and large, we felt that resiliency was a key customer value proposition. So for the most part, we've always incorporated that as a functional requirement when speccing out our microgrid projects.
Excellent. But I want to start with you on this, and Vikram, I'm sure you might have some comments as well. But how does the setup integration differ between kind of the virtual power plant or fleet DERMS kind of view versus a more essential DERMS application or a distribution utility-focused software suite?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question, because I think this is one of the challenges in this marketplace as we think about this transition that I was referring to. Let me start with the fleet DERMS or virtual power plant side of things. You know, largely what we're seeing with many of our clients is they're doing that as a direct connection to the assets. So there's always some integration with the assets themselves. Again, we try and use a lot of open standard APIs. We publish some. There's some in the industry. You have to kind of work through a bit of integration to the asset side. The back end system, so the actual software connection between that and, say, the dispatch signal, again, there's usually only 2 or 3 of those signals that come in. They may go to a wholesale marketplace. They may go to a utility system, but usually they are essentially along the lines of a set point to follow from a control standpoint and a aggregate flexibility in terms of what the virtual power plant or fleet can actually do feeding back. So our software sits in the middle and is coordinating the optimization of, you know, a set point may come in saying we need 112 megawatts, and our system is then deciding which ones of the assets can actually deliver that. So you see the integration problem there is fairly contained. When you then begin to migrate from that world to a grid integrated, or more of what I would call a distribution side DER integration, well, now you're integrating in a number of additional data streams and integration points, including the distribution management system, because you have to be tightly integrated with that. You bring in GIS, or the locational information of where those assets are actually living and sitting on the system. You're typically also bringing in other data feeds, such as load flow models, as well as potentially other forecasts that may be bringing in things like solar production or other types of forecasts on the system that are very locational. So that's where that integration challenge certainly exists, and where it is very prevalent. I think Enbal is kind of fortunate in the fact that we've been able to partner with a number of companies in the space, ABB being one of those partners, where we've actually tried to streamline that as much as possible for our customers, where we've already worked out what those integrations actually look like between the ABB ADMS product and our platform. So that becomes much more of a canned integration, so to speak. But we see this in other projects as well, where you have to go through that integration challenge.
And Vikram, obviously you guys have done some demo projects and have started working out kind of started thinking about what next steps might look like. You know, is there any lessons learned or comments you'd say to folks that are kind of starting out on that process involving those integration challenges, as you guys are kind of going at the more complex version of this, dealing with distribution grid problems and challenges?
Yeah, I think one thing I would caution is that most people attempt to find the perfect use case to demonstrate the value of DERs and for DERMS control. It's a traditional planning perspective. That's, you have a problem, you solve it using a set of tools that you're very familiar with. The truth is that not only does that tend to slightly underrepresent the value of the flexibility that DERs might provide, but it is also a bit of a dangerous game. We've seen what happens in areas of like sort of in markets like PJM with the regulation services market, where we see a rush of different sort of solutions come to play to solve a particular problem, and then the value of that market tends to dissolve a little bit. So I would caution that if you are trying to get involved in this, make it more of a holistic view to showcase, what the comprehensive benefit DER integration can provide to your utility as a whole. It shouldn't necessarily be, you can use individual use cases to quantify a portion of that benefit, and more importantly, to expose people within your organization to just the new realities of how these technologies work. That was one of the biggest things that came as a surprise to us, is that when we were working together with the system operator and with our planning team and with the ISO's PSP team, their Power Systems Planning Group, is that it wasn't so much that they were reluctant or skeptical about the value of DER. Nobody had quantified the benefits to them in a meaningful way, and that's a tricky part. Sometimes it involves kind of a leap of faith and just diving in and being able to do pilot projects and showcase the results. And in other cases, it really just involves bringing other stakeholders up to speed with some of the tools and capabilities of some of the other vendors and participants that are out there that have done this stuff before. So that's what I would say. I would say, one, don't narrow your scope to just a single use case to try to quantify the benefit, and two, seek out others who've quantified these benefits in terms that I'm just looking at from the utility lens, in terms that utilities can understand and leverage that work.
And Bud, obviously you've operated in several, you've had clients in several territories, different regulatory regimes, different wholesale markets or lack of wholesale markets for that matter amongst your customers. Are there other kind of other commonalities or differences that you run into potentially in areas without without a deregulated market, wholesale market on top of a particular utility that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I'd like to echo one thing that Vikram just mentioned, which is, absolutely this concept of kind of finding the perfect business case sometimes doesn't work. And so we do see a lot of customers who are getting started, but they still have a vision of where they're going. And I think if you can buy into the vision, you can find a direction where these things all begin to make sense, and data then leads you to many of the value propositions. But the other side of that coin is, as Vikram also accurately pointed out, more of the traditional planning-based utility or energy retailer who wants to look at the business case. I'll tell you what we're seeing in North America, and this may address one of the other questions, which is why would I say something like North America is behind other markets? Because today we're still justifying many of these kind of distributed energy resource platforms and initiatives around capacity priced-based products. And so because we're using capacity price, whether that's a wholesale market capacity price or a vertically integrated utility looking at their own integrated resource plan, we know that with the influx of renewables, we're continuing to see good business cases being penciled by both regulated, vertically integrated utilities and wholesale markets using the capacity price as the proxy for the value of the assets. The challenge comes with that, again, that transition from that world into a localized distribution connected value stream. I think Electra's done an excellent job of looking at the stacked value of those value streams. But when you move into that direction, now you have to become a little bit more speculative on what's the value of not adding equipment to my substation, those wires alternative type programs, things like that. So now it becomes, what's the value of locational benefit? What's the value of reactive power, right? So these are hard questions that we have not yet addressed in this marketplace, and that I think there's pockets of utilities, again, mostly on the regulated side, that are now trying to get their arms around that part of the value mechanism.
Yeah, well, and it's something that, when we go through research and talk to folks, we see the folks that are actually trying to justify investments, not just on a demonstration or a pilot basis, but on an actual business case basis, kind of come from one of two routes. Either it's the I know my system well enough that I can identify major capacity needs at the distribution or local transmission level, particular transmission substation, and I can identify where there might be alternative investments that we can do to better control that area to reduce the need for another 5-year planning process for a transmission line or a 2-year planning process for a new substation, et cetera. Or we see the flip side of that where there's very deep efforts to improve distribution planning processes and identify a variety of those areas that are much smaller and be able to not just put in a point-based system for a particular location system that is in one substation, but put in a system that has a broader view and can address projects that pop up on every 6 months to every year basis as distribution projects become a need above a certain cost. But it's definitely something that's been a challenge. I think buttressing this, we had several questions around kind of financing and how Electra is actually working through kind of understanding building out this solution and how they got their demonstration programs going. Can you speak a little bit, potentially, Vikram, into where exactly the funding for the demonstrations came from and how you guys are looking towards next steps from a funding perspective?
Sure. Yeah, so we focused on our demonstration projects primarily through a combination of what we can sort of categorize them as innovation funds here in the province of Ontario, and sometimes federally as well. So effectively, we would use a combination of internal stakeholder capital, so equity financing, public funding, and then in-kind contributions from our partners. Financing tends to be, I would say, exponentially easier to qualify for the more compelling the project is, and the more compelling obviously the need is. So we always had a lot of senior buy-in from our side in order to justify, at least from an experimental level, why these projects were worthwhile. Moving forward, however, we never deployed pilot projects simply for the sake of, or simply without any ambition to expand them into any sort of broader market rollout. So in each one of these cases, like in the microgrid case, for example, we've actually developed an entire service called our Midas service, which is a turnkey microgrid as a service or microgrid development service, basically, that sits in our unregulated affiliate. So in that mechanism, we've got access. That's a completely market competitive offering, and we have various sort of avenues of financing, public-private debt, and also a little bit of equity as well, depending on the model. So. And then on the flip side, the real question around the financing for pilots like, let's say, Powerhouse, which is on the residential side, or even on Penetanguishene, which are the larger scale utility side deployments. The financing is going to be, again, intrinsically tied to how we position the value of those assets to our regulator. So if we are going to finance those, there are a couple different avenues. One could be a rate-based approach. And again, it really is heavily dependent on how the regulator views us as a player in the energy distribution value chain, really. Are we an LDC and are we simply a wires company, or are we sort of shifting towards this DSO model? And with that, will we be able to basically rate base the types of tools and technologies that we need in order to help us facilitate in that transition? But it's not entirely up to the regulator. Obviously, it's our job to provide them with the proof and the evidence that that's the case. So that on that side of the equation, we're looking at different funding avenues from there. And again, customer participation will be a part of it as well. We don't expect to fund all of these initiatives entirely on our balance sheets. It'll really depend on what the offering is, what the locational requirements are, and what type of both public incentives and what portions of cost are available and what portions of cost can be rate-based. So those are all the different funding avenues, if that hopefully answers the question.
Cool. So, Bud, I have an easy question and a hard question. I'm going to start out with the easier one. We have one person I was kind of curious. I was curious about kind of motivations behind getting power from distributed resources into wholesale markets, as there's a lot more wholesale market exposure, and it's not a firm energy contract, which for a lot of resources is a helpful thing to have to make the economics work. Can you talk to a little bit about what customers usually do when they split the benefits between local customer benefits behind the meter side of things versus wholesale markets? How that value comes in from a virtual power plant layered on top of those customer benefits?
Yeah. Let me. I'm not sure if that's actually an easy question, by the way, but I will try and address it this way. It's. I think the question is right on, that you are seeing this move where, by the deployment of distributed energy resources and the ability to play in either wholesale markets or even utility programs such as demand response and things like that, once you do that, you are creating essentially a revenue stream that can either come from the market or from the utility as the aggregator. We'll just call it an aggregator, kind of sitting in the middle. And it is up to that aggregator to take a little bit of that market exposure risk. There are plenty of companies in this space that are very well experienced at being able to do that, right? And Engie, who just made an acquisition of Enernoc as an example, and E.ON, even here closer to home, large energy companies such as Shell and Total and other companies they're constantly taking those types of market risks on the commodity power marketing and power trading side all the time. So that's how we think this future kind of evolves, particularly in the deregulated markets, is we will see those types of players continue to take large positions in those markets. They will then be bringing in assets such as solar storage, demand response, load, and even behind-the-meter CHP as ways to kind of mitigate and manage that market exposure risk through flexibility, because that's ultimately what they're doing with this virtual power plant, is capturing the power of the flexibility of the assets.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's relatively accurate. It's something where you're going to get the customer benefits one way or another, outside of kind of more emerging models that are, when I say emerging, nascent models that are being tested around leasing assets purely for grid usage or leasing space on customer sites to put assets for grid usage specifically. Most of the resources, if it's behind the meter, it seems like most of those resources are going to be used for behind-the-meter use cases first, and then if there's extra that can be leveraged, or if there's a pricing condition that can be taken advantage of, it seems like those types of larger providers will get involved and go after those types of opportunities. So I think this is looking for commentary on this. I don't think anyone has the answer for it at the moment, but as we get as the amount of distributed energy resources grows significantly over the next 10, 15, 20 years, one of the questions that came up was, out of those resources, what percentage of those actually will there be a value to connecting and providing value streams or capabilities to interact with the wholesale or distribution market? As in, what percentage of resources do we need that kind of higher level of control and integration into the overall energy system?
I'll take one swing at that. While Vikram thinks of a more intelligent answer than I can give, but I think one piece of this it certainly lies in what is the definition of a distributed energy asset. I think it is actually, in this market, we are very, very caught up with expensive assets such as solar, storage, and even things like behind-the-meter generation in the form of CHP and others. But we really cannot forget our good friend, the load, that you can also leverage as part of this equation. And so when you start incorporating all of the assets, load included, I actually don't think the thresholds are actually all that big that you need to get to in order to start making the economics fundamentally work, particularly when you start following the price point of storage and solar and other things. So you start bringing those things down, projecting forward, and then looking at the ability to leverage other assets that have largely been paid for in the form of loads or electric vehicles and things like that. It's actually not a very high penetration, in my opinion. Don't have a number off the back of my hand because it varies by every utility and every jurisdiction. but I think you can actually make those business cases make today.
Yeah,
Vikram,
I guess
do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can take a stab at that. That'd be that. Yeah. Definitely a tough question to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. I would say, the first thing I would say is that, more than control, I would say visibility is probably the key. The first part of that, I'd say the more important part of that issue, which is that it's one thing for us to have to control or dispatch, and that's fine if, it's maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 30%, who knows. But intrinsically, without having a sense of the visibility for where those assets or those controllable loads or those resources are located, it gets infinitely harder for basically a distribution company or utility to be able to effectively plan for future expansion or future, reinforcement of their grid. So part of it is that I think everyone ties control and visibility together. If you can see it, if you're giving visibility to these assets, then you have to be able to control it. I don't think that's necessarily the position of the LDC or our utility as well. Really, we're focused more on visibility. Where are potentially assets like these located? And then, to be honest, that opens up customer choice. The reason that we do all this is not because we necessarily want to force or impose a particular technology on anyone. Really, the benefit of having visibility on both sides of the meter for DERs is that you don't oversize your resources on either side, right? It's just an efficiency play. And we as an LDC, or as a utility rather, are trying our best to move towards more efficient practices in planning and operations. Traditional sort of historical practices tend to be somewhat oversized, and you do tend to get into stranded asset problems. And we're getting better at it, and we're adopting more sort of analytics-based predictive methodologies to be able to build a cheaper grid that is more reliable and kind of benefits all of our ratepayers or our customers and offers them more choice. So to answer your question, how many of them have to be controllable? I mean, I'm not sure. I think that's locationally dependent, and it's pretty hard to even take a stab at. But I would like to see the highest number of penetration have as much visibility as possible so that customers have the option to participate if they want or not.
Yeah, no, I think you guys hit on both the keys there of, nobody has that answer today, but you hit on the keys of where the discussion is at the moment. One is having that ability to actually know what's happening on the grid, either through direct monitoring or indirect monitoring, just better ideas of what is coming off of a particular asset. And there is that potential that a wide variety of resources could come online as manufacturers continue to integrate better monitoring capabilities, better ramping capabilities on just traditional equipment, much less the DERs that are rapidly growing in deployment from including solar and storage. So it's definitely something that's going to change over time, but yeah, it's going to be very locationally dependent and very specific to what level of control or monitoring is required by a particular utility. So with that, I think we're going to close out. Definitely thank you so much, Vikram and Bud, for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us today. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have an archive of this up within the next 48 hours. So if you'd like to review the webinar or pass it along to colleagues, feel free to come back to greentechmedia.com for that archive. Have a great day, everyone.